In the heart of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, lies the close-knit Amish community of Millbrook, where tradition runs as deep as the fertile soil their ancestors have worked for generations. Here, reputation matters more than gold, and a man's worth is measured by his ability to work the land and provide for his family. Ezekiel Zeke Stoltzfus, a 40-year-old widower, has spent the last 3 years struggling to keep his small farm afloat after losing his beloved wife, Sarah, to cancer. Once respected as one of the community's most skilled farmers, Zeke now finds himself the subject of whispered concerns and pitying glances. His crops have failed 2 seasons in a row, his barn needs repairs he can't afford, and his 12-year-old daughter Hannah grows more distant each day, still grieving her mother's loss. When the community's annual livestock auction arrives, featuring a notorious mule named Thunder, an animal so aggressive that it has injured 3 previous owners and been returned to the auction house 4 times, everyone expects the creature to be sold for meat. But Zeke sees something different in the animal's wild eyes, a reflection of his own broken spirit and untamed grief. Against all advice and amid the laughter and judgment of his neighbors, Zeke uses his last $500 money meant for Hannah's winter clothes to purchase Thunder. What happens next will not only transform both man and beast, but will teach an entire community about redemption, the power of understanding pain, and how sometimes the most broken souls are exactly what each other needs to heal. This is a story about second chances, the courage to see potential where others see only problems, and the profound bond that can form between 2 wounded hearts, learning to trust again. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Lancaster County like a prayer half-spoken, and Ezekiel Stoltzfus stood at his kitchen window watching it rise from his failing cornfield. At 40, his hands were already mapped with the deep lines of a man who had wrestled with both soil and sorrow, and his beard, once the rich brown of fertile earth, now showed silver threads that seemed to multiply with each passing season. "Dad, you're going to be late for the auction," Hannah's voice cut through his reverie. His 12-year-old daughter stood in the doorway, her prayer cap perfectly pinned despite her young age, but her blue eyes, so much like her mother's, held a distance that made his heart ache. Zeke turned from the window, forcing a smile he didn't feel. "Just checking the weather, little one. The corn might still have a chance if we get some proper rain." Hannah's expression didn't change. At 12, she was old enough to know that hope and reality were 2 different things, and their corn, stunted and yellowing, was beyond saving. "Bishop Miller says the Yorda boys are looking for work. Maybe they could help with the harvest." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Help, charity. 2 words that once would have never been associated with the Stoltzfus name. Zeke's grandfather had built this farm from nothing, and his father had expanded it into one of the most prosperous in the district. Now, 3 years after Sarah's death, Zeke could barely keep the roof patched and the bills paid. "We'll manage," he said, the same words he'd been repeating for months. "The Stoltzfus family has always managed." Hannah nodded, but he caught the flicker of doubt in her eyes before she turned away. "I'll hitch up Belle to the buggy." "No need. I'll walk to the auction. Belle deserves her rest." The truth was, Belle was getting old, and he couldn't afford to replace her if she went lame. But Hannah didn't need to carry that worry too. The Millbrook community auction was held every 3rd Saturday of the month in a weathered barn that had witnessed more hope and heartbreak than any building had a right to. As Zeke walked the 2 miles into town, he passed farm after farm where his neighbors were already hard at work. Fields green and thriving, barns painted and proud, children laughing as they helped with morning chores. "Morning, Zeke," called out Isaac Byler from his tractor. The Amish had adapted to modern farming equipment over the years, though they still relied on horse-drawn implements for much of their work. Isaac's corn stood tall and healthy, a stark contrast to Zeke's struggling crop. "Morning, Isaac," Zeke replied, raising his hand in greeting. He tried not to notice how Isaac's smile faded slightly, replaced by the same look of concerned pity he'd been seeing for months. The auction barn was already bustling when Zeke arrived. Families clustered around the livestock pens, fathers teaching sons how to judge horseflesh, mothers keeping watchful eyes on toddlers who might wander too close to nervous animals. The air was thick with the scent of hay, animal musk, and the fried funnel cakes that Mary Lapp always sold at community events. Zeke found a spot along the back wall, away from the main crowd. He wasn't here to buy, couldn't afford to buy, but the auction was as much a social gathering as a business event, and his absence would be noted. Better to show his face, exchange pleasantries, and slip away before anyone could corner him with offers of help. He was too proud to accept. Ezekiel Stoltzfus, as I live and breathe. The booming voice belonged to Amos Fisher, the auctioneer and one of Zeke's oldest friends. Amos had been calling auctions for 20 years, and his voice could carry clear to the next county when he got excited. "Haven't seen you at one of these in months. Been keeping busy with the farm," Zeke replied, shaking Amos's meaty hand. He noticed how his friend's grip lingered a moment too long, as if trying to offer comfort through touch alone. "Course you have. Sarah always said you worked harder than any two men." Amos's expression softened. "She was proud of you, you know. Still is, I'd wager." The mention of Sarah hit like a physical blow, the way it always did. 3 years and the grief still caught him off guard, sharp and sudden as a summer storm. "I appreciate that, Amos. Well, we've got some fine stock today. Dairy cows, work horses, even a few goats that might interest Hannah. That girl's always had a way with animals, just like her mother." Before Zeke could respond, a commotion erupted near the back pens. Shouts of alarm mixed with the crash of splintering wood and the angry bray of what sounded like the devil's own beast. Men scattered as a massive mule, at least 16 hands high and built like a locomotive, reared up in his pen, striking out with hooves that could crush bone. "What in the Lord's name is that creature?" someone shouted. "That," Amos said with a grim chuckle, "is thunder. Most ornery piece of horseflesh this side of creation. Been through 4 owners in 2 years, and every one of them ended up in the hospital." Zeke found himself drawn toward the pen like iron to a magnet. Thunder was magnificent, a steel-gray mule, with the broad chest of a draft horse and the intelligent, stubborn eyes of his donkey heritage. But there was something else in those eyes, something that made Zeke's breath catch in his throat. Pain, wild, untamed pain that struck a chord deep in his chest. "Stay back, Zeke," warned Jacob Yoder, sporting a bandaged arm. "That devil nearly took my shoulder off last month." Mean clear through to his bones. But Zeke didn't step back. Instead, he moved closer, studying the animal's behavior. Thunder's ears were pinned flat against his skull, and his eyes rolled white with fear and rage. But Zeke had seen that same look in his own mirror every morning for the past 3 years. "What's his story?" Zeke asked quietly. "Came from a ranch in Ohio," Amos explained, joining them at a safe distance. "Owner said he was broke to ride and drive, gentle as a lamb, but something happened during transport. Truck accident, maybe, and he's been like this ever since. Vet says there's nothing physically wrong with him, but mentally," Amos shrugged. "Some animals just can't be fixed." Thunder paced the small pen like a caged storm, his massive hooves striking the ground with enough force to make the earth tremble. Every few seconds, he would wheel around and charge the fence, only to pull up short at the last moment, as if fighting some internal battle between aggression and fear. "What'll happen to him?" Zeke found himself asking. "Meat buyers here from Reading," Amos said quietly. "Shame, really. He's got good bloodlines, but—" He spread his hands helplessly. Around them, the other farmers shook their heads and moved on to inspect more manageable livestock. Thunder would be a footnote in the day's proceedings, a cautionary tale about buying sight unseen. But Zeke couldn't tear his eyes away from the tormented animal. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's begin today's auction." Amos's voice boomed across the barn as he took his place at the podium. "First up, We have a fine pair of Belgian draft horses, 4 and 6 years old, broke to harness and gentle with children. The attet proceeded with its familiar rhythm, Amos's melodic chant, the quick bidding wars, the satisfaction of farmers acquiring the animals they needed for another season's work. Zeke half listened to the proceedings, but his attention kept drifting back to Thunder's pen. Lot 17, Amos announced as the afternoon wore on. We have a 4-year-old mule, steel gray, 15.2 hands. Now, folks, I need to be honest with you. This animal has some behavioral issues. A nervous chuckle rippled through the crowd. Thunder, as if sensing he was the center of attention, let out a bray that could have awakened the dead and kicked the back wall of his pen hard enough to make the boards groan. "He's sound of wind and limb," Amos continued gamely. "Good bloodlines, and with the right handling he could make someone a fine work animal. Who'll give me 300 to start?" Silence stretched across the barn like a taut rope. Thunder paced and snorted, his wild eyes scanning the crowd as if looking for an escape route that didn't exist. 250? Amos tried again. "Come on, folks, look at the muscle on this animal. He's built for hard work." More silence. Someone coughed. A child whispered loudly to his mother, asking why the horse looked so angry. $100? The desperation was creeping into Amos's voice now. "He's got to be worth that for his size alone." $50? Called out a gravelly voice from the back. The meat buyer, a thin man in a stained jacket, who smelled of cigarettes and something Zeke didn't want to identify. $50? I have 50, Amos said, his usual enthusiasm notably absent. "Do I hear 70? Thunder chose that moment to rear up again, his hooves striking the air as he voiced his rage and fear in a sound that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Several women stepped back instinctively, and even some of the men looked uncomfortable. "Going once at $50, Amos said quietly. Zeke's mind flashed to Hannah's face that morning, to the distance in her eyes that seemed to grow wider every day. He thought of his failing crops, his empty bank account, and the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room. He thought of Sarah, lying in that sterile hospital bed, gripping his hand with fingers that had grown thin as winter twigs. "You've got such a good heart, Ezekiel," she had whispered in those final days. "Don't let this break that. Promise me. Don't let the pain make you stop seeing the good in things." "Going twice at $50, Amos continued. Thunder's wild eyes met Zeke's across the barn, and in that moment, something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or just the understanding that comes when two broken souls recognize each other across a crowded room. $500. The words left Zeke's mouth before his brain could stop them. A gasp went up from the crowd, and every head turned to stare at him in shock. $500, 10 times the meat buyer's offer, and money Zeke couldn't afford to lose. Did you say 500? Amos stammered, his auctioneer's composure finally cracking. 500, Zeke repeated, stepping forward through the crowd. Around him he could hear the whispers starting. What's he thinking? That man's lost his mind. Someone needs to stop him before he gets himself killed. Thunder had stopped pacing and was staring directly at Zeke, his ears pricked forward for the first time all day. The rage was still there in his dark eyes, but something else flickered beneath it. Curiosity, maybe, or the faintest glimmer of hope. "Zeke," Jacob Yuda said urgently, grabbing his arm, "you don't know what you're doing. That animal is dangerous. He'll kill you. Or worse, he'll hurt Hannah." 500 once, Amos called out, his voice uncertain. "Do I hear 550? The meat buyer was shaking his head and walking away. No one else made a sound. 500 twice. "Zeke, please," came another voice. It was Bishop Miller, the community's spiritual leader, his lined face creased with concern. "Think of your daughter. Think of your responsibilities." But Zeke wasn't thinking of responsibilities, or common sense, or the whispers that would follow him home. He was thinking of Thunder's eyes, and of Sarah's final words, and of the way pain could either break a soul or teach it to understand other broken things. Sold. Amos's gavel came down with a crack that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent bar. Lot 17 to Ezekiel Stoltzfus for $500. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, like a dam bursting, the whispers began in earnest. Zeke could feel the weight of every stare, hear the disbelief and concern in voices that had known him all his life. Has he lost his mind completely? That mule will kill him inside a week. Someone should tell Hannah to stay with relatives. Sarah would be heartbroken if she could see this. But Zeke heard none of it. He was walking toward Thunder's pen, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. The mule watched his approach, muscles tensed, ready to strike. But he didn't charge the fence this time. Instead, he stood perfectly still, as if waiting to see what this strange human, who had just changed both their lives, intended to do next. "Easy, boy," Zeke said quietly, stopping just out of striking range. "I know you're scared. I know you hurt, but maybe we can figure out how to hurt a little less together." Thunder's nostrils flared as he caught Zeke's scent, his ears swiveling forward and back as if trying to decode some impossible message. Behind them, Zeke could hear the auction resuming. Amos's voice determinedly cheerful as he moved on to the next lot. But the damage was done. By evening, every person in Millbrook would know that Ezekiel Stoltzfus had finally lost his mind and bought himself a one-way ticket to the graveyard. As Zeke stood there studying the magnificent, damaged animal that was now his responsibility, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 long years. A sense of purpose. He had no idea how he was going to train Thunder, no clue if the mule could ever be anything more than a beautiful, dangerous liability. All he knew was that Sarah had asked him not to let the pain break his good heart. And somehow, looking into this creature's wounded eyes, he felt like he was finally ready to keep that promise. The real question was whether either of them would survive the attempt. The loading of Thunder into Eli Hochstetler's livestock trailer was like trying to cage lightning with bare hands. It took 6 men, 2 ropes, and the better part of an hour just to get the mule close enough to the trailer ramp to consider the possibility of cooperation. Thunder fought every step, his powerful hindquarters bunching and releasing as he alternately charged forward and planted his feet in stubborn resistance. "Zeke, it's not too late to change your mind," Bishop Miller said quietly, standing well back from the chaos. His weathered hands gripped his black hat, knuckles white with tension. Eli would be happy to take him back to the auction house, no questions asked. Sweat dripped from Zeke's forehead despite the October chill. His simple blue shirt was soaked through, and his suspenders had twisted during the struggle. "No, Bishop, I gave my word." "Your word to a mule?" Jacob Yoder called out, barely dodging Thunder's back hooves as the animal lashed out at a shadow that existed only in his tortured mind. "This isn't about giving your word, Zeke. This is about staying alive long enough to raise your daughter." Thunder's wild eyes rolled as he caught sight of the trailer's dark interior, and he let out a bray that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. The sound bounced off the barn walls and sent several of the smaller children running for their mother's skirts. "He's remembering something," Zeke said suddenly, his voice cutting through the din. "Look at him. He's not just being stubborn. He's terrified." "Terrified animals are the most dangerous kind," Eli Hochstetler muttered, adjusting his grip on the lead rope. "Zeke, I've been hauling livestock for 30 years, and I've never seen an animal this far gone. Maybe the meat buyer was the kindest option." But Zeke had moved closer to Thunder, ignoring the concerned shouts of the men behind him. He approached from the side, keeping his movements slow and deliberate, the way Sarah used to approach spooked cats in their barn. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice barely audible above Thunder's labored breathing. "I know that trailer looks like trouble. I know you've been hurt before, but I'm not going to hurt you." Then his ears flicked toward the sound of Zeke's voice, though his body remained coiled tight as a spring. His nostrils flared, testing the air for threats that might be invisible to human eyes. "You know what I think," Zeke continued, taking another careful step closer. I think someone loaded you into a trailer once, and something terrible happened. Maybe it was dark, maybe it was loud, maybe you got hurt. But this is different. This trailer is going to take you home. Zeke, Amos Fisher warned from his position near the trailer's wheel well. Don't get too close. If he strikes. But thunder didn't strike. Instead, something remarkable happened. The massive mule lowered his head slightly, his breathing evening out just enough for the men to note. His eyes, still wide with fear, focused on Zeke with an intensity that made the air seem to thicken. That's right, Zeke said softly. I see you. I see how much you hurt. But I also see how strong you are, how smart you are. You've been fighting so hard to protect yourself that you've forgotten there might be people who don't want to hurt you. Step by careful step, Zeke approached until he was close enough to extend his hand toward Thunder's muzzle. The mule tensed, every muscle in his powerful frame ready to explode into violence. But Zeke didn't flinch, didn't pull back. He simply held his hand steady, palm up, offering nothing but the possibility of gentle contact. For a long moment, man and mule stared at each other across a chasm of fear and pain. The barn had fallen silent, except for the whisper of wind through the gaps in the weathered boards. Even the children had stopped their chatter, sensing that something important was happening. Then, so slowly it seemed like a prayer being answered, Thunder stretched his neck forward and allowed his velvet muzzle to brush against Zeke's weathered palm. The contact lasted perhaps 3 seconds before Thunder jerked his head back, but it might as well have been a lifetime. A collective breath was released by the watching crowd, and Zeke felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of a knot he'd carried for 3 long years. Well, I'll be, whispered Amos. Never seen anything like that. Load him up, Zeke said quietly, his eyes never leaving Thunder's face. He's ready now. And remarkably, impossibly, Thunder was ready. With Zeke walking beside him, speaking in the same low, soothing tones, the great mule allowed himself to be led up the ramp and into the trailer. He trembled like a leaf in a hurricane, and his breathing came in short, panicked bursts, but he didn't fight. I'll ride in the back with him, Zeke announced, climbing into the trailer before anyone could object. Absolutely not, Bishop Miller said firmly. Zeke, if that animal panics during transport, then he'll need someone there to help him through it, Zeke replied. Eli, drive slow and easy. No sudden stops, no sharp turns. Eli shook his head, but climbed into the cab of his truck. On your head be it, Zeke, Stoltzfus, but if you get yourself killed, I'm not explaining it to Hannah. The 2-mile journey from the auction barn to the Stoltzfus farm felt like crossing an ocean. Every bump in the road, every sound of the engine, every shift in the trailer's movement sent Thunder into fresh waves of panic. But each time the mule began to lose control, Zeke was there, a steady presence in the chaos, his voice cutting through the fear like a lighthouse beam through fog. Easy, Thunder. Feel how steady the ground is under your feet. Feel how the trailer's not swaying like it's going to tip. We're almost home. Almost to a place where you can rest. By the time Eli's truck pulled into the Stoltzfus farmyard, Thunder was exhausted. His coat was dark with sweat, and his breathing came in great, shuddering gasps. But he was calm, or at least calmer than he'd been since arriving at the auction. Hannah was waiting by the gate, her small face pale with worry. She'd changed from her good dress into work clothes. A simple grey dress with a black apron, her prayer cap slightly askew from whatever chores she'd been doing to keep busy while her father was gone. "Dad," she called out as Eli began backing the trailer toward the empty paddock behind the barn. "Is everything all right?" Mrs. Fisher came by and said. She trailed off as Thunder's distinctive bray echoed from inside the trailer. "Hannah, stay back," Zeke called out as he prepared to unload his purchase. "This is Thunder. He's going to be staying with us for a while." "Thunder?" Hannah's voice was small, uncertain. That's the mule everyone says is dangerous. The one that hurt Jacob Yoder." Before Zeke could answer, Sarah's voice seemed to whisper in his ear, as clear as if she was standing beside him. "Children and animals both know when you're afraid, Ezekiel. Show her strength, not fear, and she'll learn to see what you see." "He's not dangerous, Hannah," Zeke said with more confidence than he felt. "He's hurt and scared, but he's not dangerous. Not to us." The unloading went more smoothly than anyone had dared hope. Thunder practically leaped from the trailer, desperate to feel solid ground under his hooves again. But instead of immediately seeking escape, he stood in the paddock, his great head raised, nostrils flaring as he took in the sense of his new home. "Look at him," Hannah whispered, moving closer to the fence despite her father's earlier warning. He's beautiful." Thunder was beautiful, Zeke had to admit. Even in his agitated state, even with his coat dull from stress and poor care, the mule possessed a magnificent presence. His steel-grey coat would shine like polished metal once he was properly groomed, and his intelligent eyes suggested depth that went far beyond simple animal instinct. "He's also 17 hands of trouble," Eli muttered as he prepared to leave. "Zeke, I hope you know what you're doing. That animal could kick down these fence boards like matchsticks if he sets his mind to it." "Then I guess I'd better make sure he doesn't set his mind to it," Zeke replied, watching as Thunder began to pace the perimeter of the paddock, testing the boundaries of his new prison. After Eli left and the immediate chaos of Thunder's arrival settled, father and daughter stood by the paddock fence in the growing dusk. The October air carried the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke, and somewhere in the distance a barn owl called to its mate. "Dat," Hannah said quietly, her young voice heavy with questions she didn't know how to ask. "Why did you buy him? We don't have money for winter clothes, but you spent $500 on a mule that everyone says can't be tamed." It was a fair question, and one Zeke had been asking himself since the moment Amos's gavel fell. How could he explain the connection he'd felt when he looked into Thunder's eyes? How could he make his 12-year-old daughter understand that sometimes the most broken things were the ones most worth saving? "Do you remember what your mother used to say about the barn cats?" he asked instead. Hannah's expression softened slightly. She said, "The meanest cats were usually just the most scared ones." "That's right. And what did she do with them?" "She'd sit real still and talk to them soft until they learned she wouldn't hurt them. And then," Hannah's eyes widened as understanding dawned, "and then they became the most loyal cats on the farm." "Your mother had a gift for seeing past the fear to the heart underneath," Zeke said, reaching out to brush a stray curl from Hannah's forehead. "I think maybe Thunder just needs someone to see past his fear too." Thunder had stopped pacing and was standing at the far end of the paddock, as far from the humans as possible, while still being within the fence line. But his ears were pricked in their direction, and Zeke could swear the mule was listening to every word. "But what if he hurts you?" Hannah's voice was very small now, and Zeke heard in it all the fear of a child who had already lost too much. "What if something happens to you too?" The question hit him like a physical blow. In his desperation to save something, anything, from the wreckage of his life, had he forgotten that Hannah needed him to stay safe? Had he been selfish in his desire to prove that broken things could be made whole again? "Nothing's going to happen to me," he said, pulling Hannah close. "I promise you that. I'm going to be very, very careful, and I'm going to take as much time as Thunder needs. But Hannah, sometimes in life, we have to take chances on things that matter. And I think Thunder matters." "Why?" she asked, her face pressed against his shoulder. "Why does he matter?" Zeke was quiet for a long moment, watching as Thunder gradually moved closer to the fence, drawn by curiosity despite his fear. "Because," he said finally, "I think he's like us. I think he's lost something important, and he's been angry about it for so long that he's forgotten how to trust anyone. But if he can learn to trust again, maybe we can too." Hannah finished, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Maybe we can too." As if sensing he was being discussed, Thunder approached the fence where they stood. He stopped just out of arm's reach, his dark eyes studying them with an intelligence that was almost human. For a moment, the three of them, man, girl, and wounded animal, existed in perfect stillness, each measuring the others, each wondering what the future might hold. "He's not as scary up close," Hannah said quietly. "No," Zeke agreed. "He's not." Thunder snorted softly, a sound that might have been agreement or dismissal. Then he turned and walked back to the center of the paddock, where he stood, with his head raised to the darkening sky, as if listening for something only he could hear. "Come on," Zeke said, taking Hannah's hand. "Let's get some supper started. Thunder's going to need time to settle in, and we've got a long road ahead of us." As they walked toward the house, neither of them noticed Thunder turn to watch them go, his ears pricked forward, something that might have been hope flickering in his dark eyes. But the neighbors noticed everything. Within an hour of Eli's truck leaving the Stoltzfus farm, half of Millbrook knew that crazy Zeke had actually gone through with it, had brought that devil mule home and put it in a paddock not 50 yards from where his daughter played. The phone calls started immediately, voice after concerned voice sharing the same refrain. "Someone needs to do something. That man's not thinking straight. What if the mule gets loose? What if it hurts Hannah? Sarah would roll over in her grave if she knew." By the time Zeke and Hannah sat down to their simple supper of bread, butter and vegetable soup made from their garden's last harvest, Bishop Miller was already planning an intervention. By the time they said their evening prayers, Jacob Yoder was organizing a meeting of the church elders, and by the time Hannah kissed her father goodnight and climbed the narrow stairs to her small bedroom under the eaves, the entire community had reached a unanimous conclusion. Ezekiel Stoltzfus had finally lost his mind completely, and for the sake of his daughter and the safety of the community, something had to be done about it. Outside in the paddock, Thunder stood like a statue in the moonlight, his ears constantly moving, cataloging every sound of his new environment. He had been betrayed by humans before, had learned that kindness was often just a prelude to cruelty. But something about the man's voice, the gentleness in his weathered hands, the patient way he had approached without demanding immediate trust. Thunder shook his great head, trying to dislodge thoughts that felt dangerously like hope. Hope was a luxury he could no longer afford. Better to stay angry, stay ready, stay prepared for the inevitable moment when these new humans showed their true nature. But as he settled down in the soft grass for his first night on the Stoltzfus farm, Thunder couldn't quite shake the memory of the man's voice in the trailer, steady and calm in the midst of chaos, promising that everything was going to be all right. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Thunder slept without nightmares. The intervention came on Tuesday morning, exactly 4 days after Thunder's arrival, when the October frost still painted the grass silver, and the sun hung low and pale in the eastern sky. Zeke was in the paddock with Thunder, moving slowly around the perimeter, while the mule watched from the center. When the delegation arrived, Bishop Miller led the procession, his black buggy followed by 3 others, carrying the church elders and their wives. Behind them came Jacob Yoder in his pickup truck, and Isaac Byler on foot, having walked over from the neighboring farm. Even Mary Lapp had come, her usual basket of baked goods conspicuously absent. Hannah, who had been feeding the chickens, froze when she saw the convoy approaching. At 12, she understood the significance of such a gathering. The elders only traveled together like this for the most serious matters: deaths, disciplinary actions, or interventions for families in crisis. "Det," she called out, her voice tight with worry. Zeke looked up from where he'd been studying Thunder's movements, noting how the mule's ears swiveled toward every sound, cataloging threats and possibilities. The sight of 8 buggies and a truck pulling into his farmyard made his stomach clench, but he forced his expression to remain calm. "Stay with Thunder, Hannah," he said quietly. "Everything's going to be fine." But as he walked toward the gathering crowd, Zeke wasn't sure he believed his own words. Bishop Miller's face was grave, and the other men stood in a tight cluster, their usual morning greetings replaced by serious nods and concerned murmurs. "Bishop," Zeke said, removing his hat as he approached. "Elders, what brings you all to my farm so early?" Bishop Miller was a man of 68 who had shepherded the Millbrook community for more than 2 decades. His beard was white as fresh snow, and his eyes held the patient wisdom of someone who had counseled families through every imaginable crisis. But today, those eyes were troubled. "Ezekiel," he said formally, "we need to talk about the mule, about your judgment, and about Hannah's safety." "My judgment," Zeke repeated, feeling the familiar heat rise in his chest. The same anger that had sustained him through Sarah's illness and the dark months that followed. "Since when is buying livestock a matter for church discipline? Since you bought an animal that's already put 3 men in the hospital," Jacob Yoder interjected, stepping forward. His bandaged arm was still in a sling from his encounter with Thunder the previous month. "Zeke, I respect you, but this isn't about livestock. This is about a dangerous animal that doesn't belong around families." Elder Samuel Lapp nodded gravely. "Jacob's right, Ezekiel. We've all heard the stories. This mule has a history of violence." "The mule has a history of pain," Zeke corrected, his voice rising slightly. "There's a difference, is there?" Mary Lapp spoke for the first time, her usually gentle voice sharp with concern. "Ezekiel, that creature is less than 50 yards from where Hannah sleeps. What if he breaks through the fence? What if he gets into the yard while she's playing?" Thunder, as if summoned by the mention of his name, appeared at the paddock fence closest to the gathering. His ears were pinned back, and his nostrils flared as he took in the scent of so many strangers. The sight of him, 17 hands of barely contained power and wildness, sent a visible ripple of unease through the group. "Look at him," Elder David Yoder whispered. "Even now he's planning something. He's scared," Zeke said firmly. "You surrounded his territory with strange voices and strange smells. Of course he's on edge." Bishop Miller raised his hand for silence. "Ezekiel, we're not here to argue about the animal's motivation. We're here because we're worried about you, and more importantly, we're worried about Hannah." At the mention of her name, Hannah moved closer to Thunder's fence, her young face pale but determined. "There's nothing to worry about," she called out, her voice carrying across the farmyard. "Thunder hasn't hurt anyone yet," muttered Isaac Byler. "Hannah, come away from there," Mary Lapp called out sharply. "It's not safe." But Hannah didn't move. Instead, she did something that made every adult in the yard suck in a sharp breath. She reached through the fence rails and extended her hand toward Thunder's muzzle. "Hannah, no!" Multiple voices shouted simultaneously. Thunder's head whipped toward the small hand, his eyes wide. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, everyone waited for the mule to strike, to fulfill every dark prediction about his violent nature. Instead, Thunder lowered his great head and gently nuzzled Hannah's palm, his breath warm against her skin. The silence that followed was deafening. "Well," Bishop Miller said quietly, "that's unexpected." But Elder Samuel Lapp was not swayed by displays of apparent gentleness. "One moment of calm doesn't erase months of violence. Ezekiel, we're here as your friends, as your brothers in faith, to help you see reason." "What kind of reason?" Zeke asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The kind that puts a little girl's safety above your pride," Jacob Yoder said bluntly. "Zeke, I know you're still grieving Sarah. We all understand that. But you can't let that grief cloud your judgment when it comes to Hannah's welfare." The mention of Sarah hit like a slap. "Don't," Zeke said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Don't you dare use my wife's memory to justify this." "We're not using her memory," Bishop Miller said gently. "We're honoring it. Sarah loved Hannah more than life itself. Do you think she would want her daughter at risk because you formed an attachment to a dangerous animal?" "Sarah would want me to see the good in broken things," Zeke shot back. "She would want me to show Hannah that healing is possible, that just because something is hurt doesn't mean it's beyond hope." "This isn't about hope, Ezekiel," Elder David Yoder said firmly. "This is about reality. That mule is a threat, and keeping him here is selfish. Selfish, the word exploded from Zeke's mouth like a gunshot. You think I'm being selfish? I spent every penny I had saved for Hannah's winter clothes on that mule. I've been working with him for 4 days, getting barely 3 hours of sleep a night because I'm checking on him constantly. How is any of that selfish? Because you're thinking about what you need, not what Hannah needs, Mary Lapp said, her voice gentle but implacable. That child has lost her mother. She can't lose her father too. Thunder, apparently agitated by the rising voices, began to pace along the fence line. His movement drew every eye, and the tension in the group ratcheted up another notch. Look at him, Isaac Byler said. Even now he's working himself up. Zeke, what happens when he decides that fence isn't enough? What happens when he goes after Hannah the way he went after Jacob? He won't, Zeke said. But even as the words left his mouth, he could hear the doubt creeping in. What if they were right? What if his grief had clouded his judgment so completely that he was putting his daughter at risk for the sake of his own emotional needs? Bishop Miller seemed to sense the moment of weakness. Ezekiel, we're prepared to help you find Thunder a new home. There's a sanctuary in Ohio that takes difficult animals. They have the facilities, the expertise. No. The voice that cut through the bishop's words was small but firm. Hannah had left Thunder's side and was walking toward the group, her chin raised in a gesture that reminded everyone present of her mother's stubborn streak. You can't take him away. Hannah, Mary Lapp said gently. Sweetie, you don't understand. That animal is dangerous. He's not dangerous to us, Hannah said, stopping beside her father. Her small hand slipped into his, and Zeke felt the warmth of her trust flow through him like sunlight. He's getting better every day. Yesterday he let Dat brush his shoulder. This morning he came when Dat called his name. Hannah, Bishop Miller said carefully, sometimes adults have to make decisions that children don't understand. Sometimes we have to choose safety over what we want. Like when Mam got sick. Hannah asked quietly. The question hung in the air like morning fog, heavy and inescapable. Every person in the yard had been touched by Sarah's death, had watched a vibrant woman waste away despite every prayer, every hope, every desperate attempt to save her. That's different, Elder Samuel Lapp said gently. Your mother's sickness wasn't something we could control. But Thunder is. Hannah's blue eyes, so much like her mother's, fixed on each elder in turn. You want to send him away because you're scared of what might happen. But what if what happens is good? What if he gets better? What if he learns to trust again? Hannah, Bishop Miller began. What if we give up on him the way some people wanted to give up on Mam when she got sicker? Hannah continued, her voice growing stronger. What if we decide he's too broken to fix, just like some people said Mam was too sick to save? The comparison hit the gathered adults like a physical blow. Several of them had indeed counseled the Stoltzfus family to accept God's will during Sarah's final months, had suggested that perhaps it was time to let go rather than continue the exhausting rounds of treatments and specialists. That's not the same thing, Jacob Yoder said, but his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Zeke asked quietly. He was looking at his daughter with a mixture of pride and amazement. When had Hannah become so wise? When had she learned to see straight to the heart of things the way her mother had? You're asking me to give up on Thunder because he's damaged, because fixing him might be hard, because there's no guarantee it will work. How is that different from giving up on someone you other because healing them is hard? Thunder had stopped pacing and was standing perfectly still at the fence, his dark eyes fixed on the gathered humans. It was almost as if he understood that his fate was being decided, that these strangers held the power to tear him away from the first place that had felt even remotely safe since his world had been shattered. The difference, Bishop Miller said carefully, is that Sarah was a person, a member of our community, a child of God. Thunder is an animal. So, Hannah asked, does that mean he doesn't deserve a chance? Does that mean his pain doesn't matter? The question hung in the morning air, unanswered and unanswerable. Around the group, the normal sounds of farm life continued, chickens clucking, wind whispering through the corn, the distant lowing of cattle in the Bila fields. But in the circle of humans and the paddock, where thunder waited, everything was suspended. Finally, Bishop Miller spoke. "Ezekiel, we can't force you to get rid of the mule, but we can't in good conscience ignore our concerns about Hannah's safety either." "What does that mean?" Zeke asked, though the sinking feeling in his stomach suggested he already knew. "It means," Elder Samuel Lapp said heavily, "that if you insist on keeping this animal, we'll have to consider whether Hannah might be safer staying with another family until the situation is resolved." The words hit Zeke like a physical blow. "You'd take my daughter away, we'd protect her," Mary Lapp corrected gently. "Ezekiel, you're not thinking clearly. The grief, the stress of the farm failing, it's affecting your judgment. Maybe some time apart would help you gain perspective." "No." The word came out as barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute finality. "No, you will not take my daughter from me. Hannah is all I have left of Sarah, all I have left of anything good in this world. I will not let you destroy what's left, let my family, because you're afraid of an animal you don't understand." "Then get rid of the mule," Jacob Yoder said bluntly. "Make the choice, Zeke. Thunder or Hannah, because if you won't choose, we'll choose for you." The ultimatum hung between them like a sword. Choose between the broken animal that represented hope and healing, or the daughter who was the light of his life. Choose between the promise he'd made to Sarah about not letting pain break his good heart, or the reality of keeping his family together. Thunder chose that moment to approach the fence where the confrontation was taking place. His massive head extended over the top rail, and he made a sound that was part wicker, part sigh, a sound that somehow conveyed both vulnerability and strength. "That Hannah," whispered, squeezing his hand. "Please don't let them take him away. Please don't let them take me away." Looking into his daughter's eyes, Zeke saw Sarah's stubborn determination, her refusal to give up on lost causes, her absolute faith that love could overcome any obstacle. But he also saw the fear of a 12-year-old girl who had already lost too much, who was terrified of losing even more. And in that moment, Ezekiel Stoltzfus realized that sometimes the hardest battles weren't fought against external enemies, but against the impossible choices that life thrust upon you when all the options led to heartbreak. "I need time," he said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Give me a week. 1 week to prove that Thunder isn't the threat you think he is." Bishop Miller exchanged glances with the other elders. "And if you can't prove it?" Zeke looked at Thunder, then at Hannah, then back at the circle of concerned faces that had known him all his life. "Then I'll find him a new home myself." 1 week, Bishop Miller agreed reluctantly. "But Ezekiel, if that animal shows even the slightest sign of aggression, if there's even a hint of danger to Hannah—" "I understand," Zeke said quietly. As the delegation prepared to leave, their buggies creaking and santling as the men climbed aboard, Thunder remained at the fence. His dark eyes seemed to follow the conversation he couldn't understand, but perhaps could sense the import of. 1 week, Jacob Yoder repeated as he climbed into his truck. "Zeke, I hope you know what you're doing." After the last buggy disappeared down the lane, father and daughter stood in the sudden quiet of their farmyard. Thunder had moved away from the fence and was grazing peacefully in the far corner of the paddock, but the tension of the morning's confrontation still hung in the air like smoke. "Dad," Hannah said quietly, "what are we going to do?" Zeke put his arm around his daughter's shoulders and pulled her close. "We're going to prove them wrong, little one. We're going to show them that broken things can be made whole again, that damage doesn't mean dangerous, and that sometimes the most important battles are the ones everyone else thinks you can't win. And if we can't," Hannah's voice was very small, "then we'll face that when it comes," Zeke said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "But I have faith, Hannah, faith in Thunder, faith in us, and faith that your mother is watching over us all." As if he had heard his name, Thunder raised his head from the grass and looked directly at them. For a moment, man, girl, and mule seemed connected by invisible threads of hope and determination. 1 week, 7 days to work a miracle, to transform a broken animal into proof that healing was possible, that love could overcome fear. 7 days to save not just thunder, but the fragile hope that had been reborn in Ezekiel Stoltzfus's heart. The clock was ticking. The breakthrough came on Friday afternoon, with only 2 days left before Bishop Miller's deadline, in a moment that no one, not even Zeke, could have predicted. For 4 days, Zeke had worked with thunder from dawn until dusk, building trust one gentle touch at a time. He had managed to halter the great mule, had brushed his coat until it gleamed like polished steel, and had even gotten thunder to accept a lead rope without fighting. But the real test, the one that would prove to the community that thunder was truly safe, remained elusive. Thunder would allow Zeke to touch him, would even come when called across the paddock. But he remained skittish around sudden movements, nervous around loud sounds, and absolutely terrified of anything that resembled the trailer that had brought him to the farm. Most damning of all, he still pinned his ears and showed the whites of his eyes whenever anyone other than Zeke or Hannah approached. The weather had turned cold and grey, with a bitter October wind that stripped the last leaves from the maple trees and sent them skittering across the farmyard like tiny golden ghosts. Zeke was in the paddock with thunder, working on getting the mule to accept a simple rope around his barrel, the first step toward eventually training him to drive, when the accident happened. Hannah was coming home from school, her small figure bundled in a coat that was slightly too big for her, one of many hand-me-downs from church families, when she slipped on the frost-slick wooden steps of the front porch. Her books went flying, and she cried out as her ankle twisted beneath her, sending her tumbling to the ground. The sound of Hannah's cry of pain cut through the afternoon air like a knife. Zeke's head snapped up from where he'd been working with thunder, and his heart stopped as he saw his daughter lying crumpled at the bottom of the porch steps.
"Hannah!"
he shouted, dropping the rope and racing toward the fence. But thunder was faster. The great mule, who had been standing calmly in the center of the paddock just moments before, suddenly exploded into motion. But instead of running away from the commotion as everyone would have expected, he ran toward it. In 3 powerful strides, he reached the fence closest to the house, gathered himself, and leaped. 17 hands and nearly 1,000 pounds of mule sailed over the 4-foot fence as if it were a minor inconvenience. Thunder landed in the farmyard with a sound like thunder, his hooves striking the packed earth as he galloped straight toward the place where Hannah lay. "No!" Zeke screamed, visions of his daughter being trampled flashing through his mind. "Thunder, no!" But thunder wasn't running toward Hannah to hurt her. As he reached the porch, the massive mule slid to a stop with the precision of a cutting horse, his sides heaving. He lowered his great head to where Hannah sat, clutching her ankle, tears streaming down her face, and very gently nuzzled her shoulder. Hannah's sobs quieted as she felt Thunder's warm breath against her cheek. "It's okay," she whispered, reaching up to touch his muzzle with trembling fingers. "I'm okay, Thunder. I just fell." Zeke reached them a moment later, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. He knelt beside Hannah, his hands shaking as he checked her over for serious injuries. "My ankle," she said, wincing as he gently probed the joint. "I think I twisted it." Relief flooded through Zeke as he realized the injury wasn't serious, painful, but not broken. But as he helped Hannah to her feet, supporting her weight, he became aware of Thunder standing perfectly still beside them, as if the mule understood that his presence was needed. "Easy, girl," Zeke murmured to Hannah. "Let's get you inside and get some ice on that ankle." But as they began to move toward the door, Hannah stumbled, her injured ankle unable to support her weight. Zeke caught her, but the awkward angle made it difficult to help her up the steps. That's when Thunder did something that would be talked about in Millbrook for generations to come. The great mule stepped forward and positioned himself beside Hannah, lowering his shoulder so that she could lean against his solid bulk for support. Together, the 3 of them made their way up the porch steps, Zeke supporting Hannah from one side, Thunder providing a living crutch from the other. It wasn't until they reached the door that Zeke fully realized what had just happened. Thunder, The dangerous mule that the entire community wanted removed had jumped a fence to come to Hannah's aid, had offered himself as support without being asked, had shown more intelligence, compassion, and gentleness than many humans Zeke had known. "Thunder," Hannah said softly as Zeke helped her inside. "Thank you." The mule whickered softly in response, then turned and walked calmly back toward his paddock, as if jumping fences and rescuing little girls was simply part of his daily routine. But he didn't jump back over the fence. Instead, he walked to the gate and waited, as if asking permission to return to his enclosure. Zeke settled Hannah on the kitchen couch with her ankle elevated and wrapped in ice, then went outside to let Thunder back into the paddock. As he opened the gate, the mule walked through calmly, then turned to look at Zeke with eyes that seemed to hold a question. "You did good, boy," Zeke said quietly, running his hand along Thunder's neck. "You did real good." Word of Thunder's rescue of Hannah spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By evening, half the community had heard some version of the story, though the details grew more dramatic with each telling. By Sunday morning, when the families gathered for worship in the simple white church that had served the community for over a century, everyone was talking about the mule that had jumped a fence to save a little girl. Bishop Miller stood at the simple wooden pulpit, his white beard neatly knitted, his black coat pressed and formal. But instead of beginning with the planned sermon about stewardship, he cleared his throat and addressed the elephant in the room. "Before we begin worship," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the small church, "I think we need to discuss what happened at the Stoltzfus farm on Friday." Every head turned toward the pew where Zeke and Hannah sat, the girl's ankle still wrapped but healing well. Thunder's heroic act had become the talk of the community, but Zeke wasn't sure if that was good or bad for their cause. "As many of you have heard," the bishop continued, "there was an incident involving Hannah and the mule that Ezekiel purchased last week. Hannah was injured, and the animal showed behavior that has caused many of us to reconsider our previous concerns." Jacob Yuda shifted uncomfortably in his pew. He had been one of Thunder's most vocal critics, but even he couldn't deny what the mule had done. "However," Bishop Miller said, and Zeke's heart sank at the word, "one act of apparent kindness doesn't necessarily prove that an animal is safe. We've all heard stories of wild animals that seemed gentle until they suddenly weren't." But Bishop Pana spoke up from her seat, her young voice carrying clearly in the hushed church. "Thunder didn't just act kind. He acted smart. He knew I was hurt, and he knew how to help. Doesn't that count for something?" A murmur went through the congregation. Children rarely spoke during worship services, but Hannah's question hung in the air with the weight of simple truth. Elder Samuel Lapp stood slowly. "The child has a point, Bishop. What we witnessed wasn't just an animal responding to noise or commotion. It was deliberate, thoughtful. It was miraculous," added Mary Lapp, her voice soft but firm. "I've been thinking about it for 2 days, and I can't come up with any other word for it. That mule jumped a fence to help a child. How do we explain that away?" Isaac Byler, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. "Maybe we don't explain it away. Maybe we accept that sometimes we're wrong about things, about animals, about people, about what's possible when someone refuses to give up on something broken." The words hit the congregation like stones dropped in still water, ripples of understanding spreading from pew to pew. These were people who had grown up with animals, who understood the difference between trained behavior and genuine intelligence, between coincidence and purpose. Bishop Miller was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands gripping the sides of the pulpit. "Ezekiel," he said finally, "would you and Hannah join me outside for a moment?" The three of them walked out into the crisp October morning, the sound of the congregation's whispered conversations following them through the open door. In the distance, Zeke could see his farm, could see the paddock where Thunder was undoubtedly grazing peacefully, unaware that his fate was being decided in a small white church 2 miles away. "Hannah," Bishop Miller said gently, kneeling down so he was at eye level with the girl, "I want you to tell me exactly what happened on Friday." Not what you think I want to hear, not what might help your father's case. Just the truth. Hannah's blue eyes were steady as she met the bishop's gaze. I fell on the porch steps and hurt my ankle. I cried out because it hurt really bad. Thunder was in his paddock with Det, but when he heard me cry, he jumped the fence and came to help. How do you know he came to help? The bishop asked. How do you know he wasn't just startled by the noise? Because, Hannah said simply, he stopped right beside me and was gentle. If he was just scared or startled, he would have kept running. But he stopped and nuzzled me, like he was checking to make sure I was okay. And then when Det was helping me up the steps, Thunder moved so I could lean on him. Nobody taught him to do that. He just knew. Bishop Miller looked at Zeke. And you believe the animal acted with genuine intelligence, genuine compassion? I believe, Zeke said carefully, that Thunder understood Hannah was in pain, and he wanted to help. Whether you call that intelligence or instinct or something else, I don't know. But I know what I saw, and what I saw was an animal that cared more about helping a hurt child than about his own safety. The bishop was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the rolling hills that surrounded their small community. These were good people, Zeke knew, people who genuinely cared about each other's welfare. Their concerns about Thunder hadn't come from malice, but from love. Love for Hannah, love for their community, love for a man they were afraid was making dangerous decisions in his grief. There's something else, Hannah said suddenly. Something I haven't told anyone. Both men looked at her with surprise. The night Thunder came to our farm, she continued, I couldn't sleep, so I got up and looked out my window, and I saw him in the paddock. He was just standing there looking up at the sky, and he looked so sad, like he was missing someone, the way I miss Ma'am. Her voice grew quieter. I think Thunder lost someone too. I think that's why he was so angry and scared. And I think when he heard me cry, it reminded him what it felt like to want to help someone you care about, even if you can't really fix what's wrong. The simple wisdom of her words hit both men like a revelation. Of course, Thunder's aggressive behavior, his fear of trailers, his terror of being handled, it all pointed to trauma, to loss, to a creature that had learned that the world was dangerous and that trusting humans led only to pain. You think the mule was grieving, Bishop Miller said slowly. I think Thunder and Dart are both grieving, Hannah said. And I think maybe that's why they understand each other. Bishop Miller stood slowly, his joints creaking with age and the weight of difficult decisions. Ezekiel, I owe you an apology. We all do. We were so focused on Thunder's past behavior that we forgot to look at what was actually happening in the present. You were trying to protect Hannah, Zeke said. I can't fault you for that. No, it was more than that, the bishop admitted. We were afraid of change, afraid of the unknown, afraid that if we were wrong about Thunder being dangerous, we might be wrong about other things too. Sometimes it's easier to stick with fear than to open ourselves up to hope. The sound of buggies and cars approaching made them all turn. The rest of the congregation was emerging from the church. Services apparently concluded. But instead of dispersing to their homes for Sunday dinner, they were gathering in the churchyard, waiting. They want to know what we've decided, Bishop Miller said. Have we decided? Zeke asked. The bishop smiled, the first genuine smile Zeke had seen from him in weeks. I think a certain mule decided for us on Friday afternoon. The question now is whether we are wise enough to listen. As they walked back toward the waiting congregation, Hannah slipped her hand into her father's. Does this mean Thunder gets to stay? I think, Zeke said, squeezing her small fingers. It means Thunder was never the one on trial. We were. And thanks to him, I think we all passed. The congregation gathered around them in a loose circle, faces expectant but no longer hostile. These were people who had seen their assumptions challenged and found them wanting, who had witnessed something that couldn't be easily explained away. Friends, Bishop Miller said, his voice carrying across the churchyard. I think we've learned something important this week. We've learned that sometimes the most broken among us are the ones who understand healing best. We've learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act with love despite our fear. And we've learned that miracles don't always come in the form we expect. He paused, looking around the circle of familiar faces. Thunder will stay with the Stoltzfus family, where I believe he belongs. And I think we all owe Ezekiel and Hannah an apology for doubting their judgment. A murmur of agreement went up from the crowd. Jacob Yoda stepped forward, his injured arm still in its sling. Zeke, he said, extending his good hand. I was wrong. About Thunder, about your judgment, about what that animal was capable of. I'm sorry. One by one, the others followed suit. Apologies given and accepted, hands shaken, the community coming together again around a shared understanding that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. As the crowd began to disperse, Isaac Byler approached Zeke with a thoughtful expression. You know, Zeke, I've been thinking about what happened with Thunder, and I have an idea. My corn harvest is going to be bigger than I expected this year, and I could use some help getting it in. Thunder looks like he's built for heavy work. What do you say we put him to the test? Zeke felt a surge of hope that had nothing to do with mules and everything to do with community, with acceptance, with the possibility that broken things, animals and people alike, could find their way back to wholeness. I think Thunder would like that, he said. I think he'd like it very much. As they drove home in their simple buggy, Hannah leaning against her father's shoulder, Zeke caught sight of Thunder in his paddock. The great mule was standing at the fence closest to the road, as if he had been waiting for their return. Look, Dad, Hannah said softly. He was watching for us. Yes, Zeke agreed, feeling a peace settle in his chest that he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. I think he was. That evening, as the sun set behind the rolling hills of Lancaster County, Ezekiel Stoltzfus stood in Thunder's paddock, brushing the mule's gleaming coat, and thinking about miracles, not the flashy kind that made headlines, but the quiet kind that happened when broken hearts learned to trust again, when communities chose love over fear, when a damaged animal and a grieving man found healing in each other's company. Thunder stood perfectly still under Zeke's gentle touch, his dark eyes peaceful for the first time since arriving at the farm. And in that peaceful moment, Zeke could almost hear Sarah's voice on the evening wind, telling him that some promises were worth keeping, no matter how impossible they seemed. The mule that everyone said couldn't be saved had saved them all. 1 year later, on a crisp October morning that painted the Lancaster County hills in shades of gold and crimson, Ezekiel Stoltzfus stood in his thriving cornfield, watching his daughter and Thunder work together with a harmony that still took his breath away. Hannah, now 13 and grown tall like her mother, sat atop Thunder's broad back as the great mule pulled a small cart loaded with the season's final harvest. But this wasn't the broken, terrified animal that had arrived at their farm 12 months ago, nor was this the same grieving man who had made an impulsive purchase that shocked his community. Thunder's steel-gray coat gleamed like polished silver in the morning sun, his muscles rippling with controlled power as he navigated the rows of corn with the precision of a master craftsman. His ears swiveled constantly, not in fear now, but in alert attention to Hannah's soft commands and the world around them. The wild rage in his eyes had been replaced by an intelligence so profound that visitors often stopped mid-sentence when they first met his gaze. "Easy, Thunder," Hannah called out as they approached a particularly full section of corn. "Let's take our time here." The mule slowed immediately, his massive hooves finding purchase carefully between the rows. He had learned to read not just Hannah's voice, but her moods, her needs, even her unspoken thoughts. The bond between them had become something that transcended the ordinary relationship between human and animal. It was a partnership built on mutual respect, understanding, and love. Zeke smiled as he watched them work. The transformation had been gradual, but complete. Thunder had become not just a working animal, but a member of their family. He pulled their cart to town, helped with the heaviest farm work, and had even learned to be gentle with the youngest children in the community. But more than that, he had become a living symbol of redemption, proof that broken things could indeed be made whole again. The sound of approaching hoofbeats, Zeke turned toward the lane. A familiar black buggy was making its way up the drive, and Zeke's heart warmed as he recognized Bishop Miller's distinctive figure, holding the reins. "Ezekiel," the bishop called out as he climbed down from his buggy. "Beautiful morning for harvest." "The best kind," Zeke agreed, walking over to greet his old friend. Their relationship had deepened considerably over the past year, built on mutual respect for the lessons they had all learned from Thunder's arrival. "I have some news," Bishop Miller said, his eyes twinkling with barely contained excitement. "Good news, I hope you'll think." Before Zeke could ask what kind of news, Hannah and Thunder emerged from the cornfield, the cart now fully loaded with ears of corn that gleamed like golden treasure. Thunder stopped at Zeke's signal, and Hannah slipped down from his back with the easy grace of someone who had spent countless hours learning to move with her partner. "Bishop Miller," she said, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "Did you come to see how much corn we harvest?" "I did indeed," the bishop replied, but his attention was caught by something else entirely. "Hannah, would you mind showing me how Thunder responds to commands now?" Hannah beamed with pride. Over the past year, she had become Thunder's primary trainer, her patient, intuitive approach proving even more effective than her father's methodical techniques. Under her guidance, Thunder had learned not just to work, but to communicate in ways that sometimes seemed almost supernatural. "Thunder," Hannah said clearly, "can you show Bishop Miller how you greet friends?" The great Mule stepped forward and lowered his massive head in what could only be described as a bow. It was a trick Hannah had taught him months ago, but it never failed to impress visitors. "Remarkable," Bishop Miller murmured. "And he does this reliably, every time," Hannah said proudly. "Thunder, can you show him how you say goodbye?" Thunder raised his head and whickered softly, a sound so gentle and musical that it seemed impossible it could come from the same animal that had terrorized 3 previous owners. "Which brings me to my news," Bishop Miller said, turning back to Zeke. "Word of Thunder's transformation has spread beyond our community, far beyond, as it turns out." Zeke felt a flutter of unease. "What do you mean?" "There's a man coming to visit next week. Dr. James Harrison from the University of Pennsylvania. He's a researcher who studies animal behavior, particularly trauma recovery in large animals. He's heard about Thunder and wants to document his story." "Document it how?" Hannah asked, moving protectively closer to Thunder's shoulder. "He wants to study Thunder's training methods, understand how you achieved such a complete transformation. Apparently, what you've accomplished here is considered quite extraordinary in academic circles." Zeke felt the old protective instincts rising. "Thunder isn't a laboratory animal, Bishop. He's not a specimen to be studied." "Of course not," Bishop Miller said quickly. "Dr. Harrison isn't interested in taking Thunder anywhere or subjecting him to tests. He simply wants to observe, to learn. He believes that Thunder's recovery could help other traumatized animals." Hannah's eyes widened with understanding. "You mean Thunder could help other animals like he helped us?" "That's exactly what I mean," the bishop said. "Dr. Harrison says there are horses, mules, and other animals all over the country that have been written off as dangerous or untrainable because of trauma. If he can understand how Thunder healed, he might be able to help them too." The idea settled over them like morning mist, beautiful and transformative. Thunder, who had once been considered beyond hope, could become hope for others like him. "What would it involve?" Zeke asked carefully. "A few days of observation. Dr. Harrison would watch you and Hannah work with Thunder, document his responses, maybe ask some questions about your methods. Nothing invasive, nothing that would disrupt Thunder's routine or well-being." Zeke looked at his daughter, seeing in her expression the same mixture of excitement and protectiveness he felt himself. "What do you think, Hannah?" Hannah was quiet for a moment, her hand resting on Thunder's neck, as if drawing wisdom from their connection. "I think," she said finally, "that if Thunder can help other animals, find their way home. Then we should let Dr. Harrison come, but only if Thunder wants to. As if understanding the conversation, Thunder nuzzled Hannah's shoulder and made a soft sound that somehow conveyed agreement. Then it's settled, Zeke said. Tell Dr. Harrison he's welcome to visit. The week passed quickly, filled with the usual rhythms of farm life, but tinged with anticipation. When Dr. Harrison arrived on the following Tuesday, driving a modest sedan rather than the official university vehicle they had expected, his first words put them all at ease. Before we begin, he said, extending his hand to Zeke, I want you to know that I'm here as a guest. It's your home, not as a researcher studying subjects. What you've accomplished with Thunder is remarkable, and I'm honored that you're willing to share it. Dr. Harrison was a man in his 50s, with kind eyes and graying hair, wearing simple clothes that wouldn't spook the animals. He spent the first hour simply observing Thunder from a distance, watching how the mule interacted with his environment, with Zeke and Hannah, and with the other farm animals. May I ask, he said eventually, what you believe was the key to Thunder's transformation? Hannah and Zeke exchanged glances. It was a question they had asked themselves many times over the past year. Time, Zeke said finally, and patience, and understanding that his anger came from pain, not from meanness. But mostly, Hannah added, it was love. Not the kind of love that tries to fix everything right away, but the kind that just stays, even when things are hard. Dr. Harrison nodded slowly. And how did you know when to push and when to wait? Thunder told us, Hannah said simply, not with words, but with his body, his eyes, his breathing. We learned to listen to what he was saying, even when he couldn't say it the way humans do. Over the next 3 days, Harrison observed dozens of interactions between Thunder and his family. He watched Thunder work in the fields with the steady reliability of a seasoned farm horse. He saw the mule's gentle interactions with children from neighboring farms who came to visit. He documented Thunder's responses to various commands, his problem-solving abilities, and most remarkably, his apparent emotional intelligence. In 30 years of studying animal behavior, Dr. Harrison told them on his final evening, I've never seen such a complete psychological recovery. Thunder isn't just functional, he's thriving. He's confident, secure, and deeply bonded with his human family. He saved us as much as we saved him, Zeke said quietly. Maybe more. That's what makes this so remarkable, Dr. Harrison replied. True healing is always reciprocal, but what you've created here goes beyond individual recovery. You've demonstrated something that could revolutionize how we approach animal trauma. On the morning of Dr. Harrison's departure, he made an unexpected request. I'd like to bring some colleagues to visit in the spring, if you're willing, not to study Thunder, but to learn from you. There are veterinarians, animal behaviorists, and trainers who work with traumatized animals every day. What you've discovered here, about patience, about listening, about the healing power of unconditional love, could help thousands of animals. Hannah looked at Thunder, who was standing peacefully in his paddock, watching the preparations for Dr. Harrison's departure with calm interest. What do you think, Thunder? Do you want to be a teacher? Thunder walked to the fence and rested his great head over the top rail, directly in front of Dr. Harrison. For a moment, man and mule regarded each other with mutual respect. I think, Dr. Harrison said softly, that's a yes. As the researcher's car disappeared down the lane, Hannah turned to her father with shining eyes. Dad, do you realize what this means? Thunder is going to help other animals all over the country, animals that everyone else has given up on. Zeke pulled his daughter close, feeling a profound sense of completion. Your mother would be so proud, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Of Thunder, of you, of what we've built here. She is proud, Hannah said with the quiet certainty that had become her trademark. I can feel her sometimes when I'm working with Thunder. She's here, watching over all of us. That evening, as the sun set behind the rolling hills of Lancaster County, the three of them, man, girl and Mule, stood together in the paddock that had become Thunder's sanctuary. The great Mule grazed peacefully nearby while Zeke and Hannah sat on the fence rail, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Dad," Hannah said quietly, "do you remember what you told me the night Thunder came home? About how sometimes we have to take chances on things that matter." "I remember. I'm glad you took a chance on Thunder. I'm glad you didn't listen to everyone who said it was hopeless." Zeke smiled, thinking of all the ways their lives had changed since that impulsive decision at the auction barn. His farm was thriving again, with Thunder's help making the work manageable for one man and his daughter. His relationship with Hannah had deepened into a partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose, and his standing in the community had been transformed from object of pity to source of inspiration. But more than any of that, Zeke had found his way back to hope. "You know what the best part is," he said, wrapping his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "What's that? We didn't just save Thunder. We proved that broken things can be made beautiful again. That damage doesn't mean worthless. That with enough love and patience, any heart can learn to trust again." Thunder, as if he had been listening to their conversation, walked over to where they sat and gently nuzzled Hannah's hand. In his dark eyes, there was no trace of the wild fear that had once consumed him. Instead, there was peace, contentment, and something that looked remarkably like gratitude. "Thank you," Hannah whispered to the great Mule, pressing her forehead against his soft muzzle. "Thank you for teaching us that healing is possible." As they walked back to the house together, Thunder following like a gentle giant, Zeke felt Sarah's presence so strongly it took his breath away. She was there in Hannah's compassionate heart, in Thunder's transformation, in the community's capacity for forgiveness and growth. She was there in the second chances that had multiplied into third and fourth chances, in the love that had overcome fear, in the proof that sometimes the most broken souls are exactly what each other needs to heal. The Mule that everyone said couldn't be saved had saved them all, not just the Stoltzfus family, but an entire community that had learned to see beyond fear to the possibility of redemption. And now, Thunder's story would ripple outward, touching lives and healing hearts in ways they could barely imagine. In the distance, a barn owl called to its mate, and Thunder answered with a soft whicker that seemed to carry on the evening breeze like a benediction. Some stories, Zeke realized, never really end. They just grow larger, touching more lives, proving over and over again that love is always stronger than fear, that hope is always worth the risk, and that sometimes the most impossible things are the most necessary. As the farmhouse lights came on against the gathering darkness, casting warm yellow rectangles across the farmyard, Thunder settled down in his paddock for another peaceful night. In the morning there would be work to do, visitors to welcome, and other broken souls to help heal. But tonight, there was simply contentment, the deep, abiding peace that comes when lost things find their way home.